For 8 years. I watched my son walk into the bank at exactly 9 in the morning on Mondays. I thought it was just business. Then he died, and the bank manager called me down to open his safety deposit box. Inside, I found no gold or stocks. I found the terrified handwriting of a man I thought I knew, and a secret that turned my grief into a cold, hard need for vengeance. My name is Evelyn Harrow. I am 52 years old, a widow, and until last week, I lived a quiet life in Clearwater Bend that revolved around the small, predictable orbits of a retired archivist. I spent my days organizing the past of others, never suspecting that the most complex history was being written right under my nose by my own flesh and blood. Julian was my only son. He was 34, handsome in that sharp, modern way, and incredibly successful. Or at least, that is what the town saw. For 8 years, like clockwork. He parked his polished sedan in front of Glenstone Trust at exactly 9 in the morning every single Monday. I used to watch him from the window of the diner across the street, where I met my friends for coffee. He looked so important in his tailored suits. I told everyone he was checking on his investments. He was a wealthy man, a successful entrepreneur, so it made sense. I never asked him about it. I assumed it was just money. That assumption is the heaviest thing I carry now. Over the years, the space between us grew wide and silent. He was always busy. "I have to work late, Mum," he would say, or maybe next week. I let him go. I let the drift happen because I thought he was building a life. I did not know he was dismantling one. Then came the Tuesday that shattered my world. A car accident on Route 9. They said he lost control. The police report used words like high speed and impact, but all I heard was gone. My beautiful, distant boy was gone. The funeral was a blur of black umbrellas and meaningless casseroles. People whispered that it was a tragedy, a young life cut short. I sat in my living room, surrounded by flowers that smelled like a funeral home, drowning in guilt. I realized I did not know the man my son had become. I knew his schedule, but I did not know his heart. The call came 3 days after the burial. Mrs. Harrow, the voice on the other end, asked. It was Mr. Sterling, the branch manager at Glenstone Trust. "I am terribly sorry for your loss. Julian was a valued client." "Thank you," I managed to say. My voice sounded thin and brittle. "We need to discuss his safety deposit box," Mr. Sterling continued. "As his executor, you are the only one with access. There are protocols for the contents." I rubbed my temples, trying to push away the headache that had taken up permanent residence behind my eyes. "I understand. I suppose it is just deeds and bonds. I can come by next week to sign the release forms." There was a long pause on the line. It lasted long enough for the air in the kitchen to feel heavy. "Mrs. Harrow." "Mr. Sterling said, his voice dropping an octave. "I do not think this is just paperwork, given the regularity of his visits and the nature of the box. Well, I believe what you find might be unexpected." A cold shiver went down my spine. It was not the air conditioning. It was a warning instinct I had not felt since Julian was a toddler reaching for a hot stove. Unexpected. That was not a word bankers used for standard assets. "What do you mean?" I asked. "I cannot say more over the phone," he replied. "But please come today, and Mrs. Harrow, prepare yourself." I hung up the phone. I stood in my kitchen for a long time, staring at the dust motes dancing in the afternoon light. Most mothers would have called a lawyer or a friend. I did not. A strange resolve settled in my chest, pushing aside the grief for just a moment. If Julian had a secret, I wanted to be the first to hold it. I wanted to know him, even if it was too late. I grabbed my purse and my car keys. I did not call anyone. I drove to Glenstone Trust alone, my heart pounding a rhythm against my ribs that felt like a countdown. I had spent 8 years watching him walk through those doors from a distance. Today, I would follow him. I just never imagined that walking through those doors would be the first step in a war I did not know I had to fight. Mr. Sterling led me past the teller counters and through a heavy steel door that required both a key and a code. The air inside the vault was recycling centre cold and smelled of old dust and money. My heels clicked on the tile floor, a sharp, lonely sound that echoed off the rows of metal boxes. "Box 402, Mr. Sterling said, stopping in front of a drawer that looked exactly like all the others. He hesitated before sliding his key into the lock. "Mrs. Harrow, I feel I must tell you. In all my years here, I have never seen anyone as disciplined as Julian. Every Monday, rain, snow, or holiday. If we were closed, he was here the very next morning at opening. He never missed a week, not once in 8 years. He was a creature of habit," I said, though my stomach twisted. That was a lie. Julian was spontaneous. He used to leave his laundry for weeks. He used to forget birthdays. This discipline was not natural. It was forced. Mr. Sterling turned the key. I turned mine. The lock tumbled with a heavy thud. He pulled the long metal box out and carried it to a small, private viewing room. He set it on the table and stepped back. "I will be right outside," he said softly. I waited for the door to click shut before I lifted the lid. I braced myself for stacks of cash or maybe gold coins. I braced myself for illegal drugs. I was not ready for what I found. Paper. Just paper. I reached in and pulled out a handful of thin, crinkled slips. They were bank transfer receipts. Hundreds of them. I began to sort them on the table, my hands trembling. The dates went back 8 years. Every single receipt was for a cash deposit. The amounts varied, but were always significant. $3,000, $5,000, sometimes $10,000. I looked at the beneficiary field. The name was the same on every single slip. Margot Ellery. "Who are you?" I whispered to the empty room. "Who are you? And why did my son give you?" I did the mental math, and the total made me dizzy. Julian had transferred nearly $2 million to this woman over the last decade. But the receipts were just the surface. Underneath the financial trail lay a stack of envelopes. They were addressed to Margot but had no stamps. They had never been mailed. I picked up the one on top, my fingers brushing against the familiar texture of Julian's personalized stationery. I opened it. The handwriting was Julian's, but it was jagged and rushed. The ink was pressed hard into the paper, as if he had been writing with a heavy, angry hand. I read the first line and felt the air leave my lungs. I can't do this anymore. Margot. I look at my mother's face, and I feel sick. I am selling the lake house. It is the only way to get the cash he wants by Monday. I grabbed another letter. He called me at the office today. He knows about the account. He says if I miss a payment, he will go to the police about you. I am trapped. Margot. We are both trapped. Tears blurred my vision. This was not an affair. This was not generosity. My son was being bled dry. He was living in terror. I shuffled through the papers frantically until I found a sheet that looked unfinished. It was dated just 2 days before his accident. The pen strokes were erratic, trailing off at the end. I held the paper up to the light, reading the words that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Margot, Mom shouldn't know this, but he is forcing me to continue. I told him I have nothing left to give, and he laughed. He said he would take the house next. I am going to meet him tonight. I have to make it stop. I cannot let Weston Hale destroy everything we have left. The name hit me like a physical blow. Weston Hale. I dropped the letter. It fluttered to the table, landing on top of the pile of receipts. Weston Hale. The venture capitalist. The philanthropist. The man whose face was on billboards on the highway. The man who sat on the board of the very hospital where Julian was born. I gripped the edge of the table to keep from falling. Julian had not been investing on Monday mornings. He had been paying a ransom. For 8 years. My son had walked into this bank, terrified and alone, draining his life away to protect someone named Margot and to keep a monster at bay. Oh, Julian. I choked out, covering my mouth to stifle a sob. My poor, sweet boy. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you let me help you? But as the grief washed over me, something else rose up to meet it. It was cold and sharp and dangerous. I looked at the name Weston Hale again. My son did not die in an accident. A man who writes that he is going to confront his tormentor does not accidentally drive off the road 2 days later. I wiped my face with the back of my hand. I gathered the letters and the receipts and shoved them into my purse. I did not care about the bank protocols. I was taking this. I stood up and smoothed my skirt. My hands were no longer shaking. Julian had spent 8 years being afraid. He had died afraid. I looked at my reflection in the darkened window of the viewing room. The tired, grieving widow was gone. In her place was a mother who had absolutely nothing left to lose. You made a mistake, Mr. Hale. I whispered to the silence. You should have killed me too. I walked out of the room to find the truth, no matter the cost. I sat at my dining room table, surrounded by the ghosts of my son's financial life. The silence of the house was absolute, broken only by the hum of my old laptop. I typed the name Margot Ellery into the search bar, expecting a LinkedIn profile or perhaps a social media page filled with vacation photos. Instead, I found a digital tombstone. Margot Ellery had not posted a photo in 6 years. The first result was a grainy image from a local news archive. It was a missing person poster. The headline read, "Local accountant vanishes without a trace." I clicked the link, my heart hammering against my ribs. The article was short, dismissive even. It stated that Margot, 26 years old at the time, had been last seen leaving her office late one Tuesday night. The police had closed the file after 3 months, citing a lack of evidence and speculating that she had left town voluntarily. Voluntarily. I scoffed to the empty room. People do not leave their lives behind voluntarily without taking a single dollar from their bank accounts. I looked at the dates on the receipts I had stolen from the safety deposit box. The first transfer from Julian to the account in Margot's name was dated October 14th, 6 years ago. That was exactly 2 days after the police report said Margot went missing. The air in the kitchen felt suddenly thin. I lined up the papers. Margot vanishes 2 days later. My son starts draining his accounts. He pays every single week for 8 years. It wasn't an investment, I whispered, realizing the horrific logic of it. It was hush money. I turned my attention to the other name, Weston Hale. Unlike Margot, Weston was everywhere. His digital footprint was pristine. He was a venture capitalist, a philanthropist, a man who sat on museum boards and hosted charity galas. He lived in Stone Pine Ridge, an enclave of wealth 20 miles north of Clearwater Bend. I dug deeper, ignoring the polished PR articles, looking for the cracks. I found an old business forum thread from 7 years ago. A user mentioned a failed merger between Julian's small startup and Hale's massive conglomerate. The deal had fallen through, and the user claimed Hale had been furious. "You destroyed him," I said, staring at Weston's smiling face on the screen. "You did not just ruin the deal. You took his life apart, piece by piece." The theory formed in my mind with cold precision. Margot knew something. She worked for Hale. I found that connection in a cached employee directory. She knew something dangerous. She disappeared, and Julian began paying. Was it ransom? Was he paying to keep her alive, or was he paying to keep a secret that she had died for? I printed the pages, the missing person report, the corporate headshot of Weston Hale, and the map to his estate. I taped them to the wall next to Julian's receipts. It looked like the work of a madwoman, but I had never felt more sane. I knew I had to go see him. The police would not listen to me. I had no bodies, no weapons, just a stack of bank transfers and a mother's intuition. If I went to the authorities now, Weston Hale would have his lawyers bury the evidence before an investigation even opened. I needed him to slip up. I needed to look him in the eye. It is dangerous. Evelyn, I told myself. He is powerful. He might have killed Margot. He might have killed Julian. But the fear that should have stopped me was absent. It had been burned away by the image of Julian's terrified handwriting. He is forcing me to continue. My son had lived in hell for 8 years to protect me. The least I could do was walk into the fire to find out why. I spent the rest of the night studying Weston Hale. I memorized his schedule from social media check-ins. I analyzed his public statements. He was arrogant. He liked control. He liked to be the smartest person in the room. That was his weakness. He would look at me and see a grieving, elderly widow. He would see a harmless old woman confused by paperwork. He would never suspect that I was analyzing his cash flow and cross-referencing his shell companies. I packed the copies of the receipts into my handbag. I checked the address in Stone Pine Ridge one last time. "You think you are untouchable," I said, looking at his picture. "You think the game ended when Julian's car went off the road, but you have no idea what you have just started." I turned off the laptop. The house was dark, but my path was clear. I would go to Stone Pine Ridge in the morning. I would knock on the devil's door, and I would not leave until I saw him flinch. Stone Pine Ridge was less a neighborhood and more a fortress built to keep reality at bay. The iron gates were 12 feet high, and the security guard in the booth looked more like a private military contractor than a gatekeeper. I rolled down the window of my 10-year-old sedan, feeling the hum of the engine vibrating through the steering wheel. "Can I help you, Mom?" the guard asked, his eyes scanning the dents on my car door. "I am Evelyn Harrow," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I am here to see Mr. Hale. It is regarding the estate of my son, Julian Harrow. There are financial matters that involve Mr. Hale directly. It was a gamble. I did not have an appointment. But men like Weston Hale are driven by 2 things, control and money. The mention of Julian's estate and the implication of unresolved finances was the bait. The guard made a call. A minute later, the heavy gates swung open. The driveway was a winding ribbon of asphalt that led to a sprawling modern mansion of glass and steel. It looked cold. It looked like a place where secrets went to be buried under expensive marble floors. I parked and walked to the massive front door. A housekeeper let me in and left me in a living room that felt more like a museum lobby than a home. 5 minutes later, Weston Hale entered. He was taller than he looked in the photos. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my car, and his movement was fluid. Practiced? He did not smile, but his expression was carefully arranged into a mask of polite concern. "Mrs. Harrow," he said, extending a hand that was dry and cool. "I was surprised to hear you were at the gate. Please accept my deepest condolences. Julian was a bright young man. A terrible tragedy." "Thank you," I said, taking his hand briefly before pulling away. "It has been very hard. The accident was so sudden." "Yes," Weston said, gesturing for me to sit on a stiff leather sofa. "I heard the police report mentioned speed. Julian always did live fast. I suppose it caught up with him. The casual cruelty of his words made my blood boil, but I forced my face to remain blank. He was testing me. He wanted to see if I suspected anything. He was very stressed lately," I said, clutching my handbag tight. "He left behind a lot of paperwork. I have been trying to sort through it all. It is so confusing for me." Weston leaned back, crossing his legs. He looked bored, I can imagine. "If there are outstanding business contracts between our firms, my lawyers can handle it. You did not need to drive all the way out here. I thought it was better to speak in person," I said, looking him directly in the eyes. "Because of the recurring payments? The ones he made every Monday morning for 8 years?" Weston froze. It was subtle, just a slight tension in his jaw. But I saw it. "I am not sure what you are referring to," he said, his voice dropping a fraction of an octave. "I found the receipts in his safety deposit box," I continued, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. "And the letters. He wrote a lot about a woman named Margot Ellery. Do you know her?" The reaction was immediate. The bored billionaire vanished. In his place was a predator who had just heard a twig snap in the woods. His pupils dilated. He uncrossed his legs and leaned forward, his eyes narrowing into slits. "I do not know anyone by that name," he said. The denial came too fast. "That is strange," I said, feigning innocence, because in the letters, Julian mentioned that you and she worked together. He seemed to think you were very angry with her." Weston stood up abruptly. He walked to the window, turning his back to me. I saw his hand clench into a fist at his side. He was rattled. He was terrified. "Mrs. Harrow," he said, not turning around. Julian was clearly disturbed toward the end. "Grief makes people imagine connections that do not exist. I think you are tired." "I am not tired." "Mr. Hale," I said, standing up as well. "I am just a mother looking for answers. Why was my son paying a ghost, and why was he so afraid of you?" Weston turned around slowly. The mask was gone completely now. His face was hard, his eyes cold and lifeless. He walked toward me until he was uncomfortably close, invading my personal space. "You are a grieving mother," he said softly, but the tone was razor sharp. "So I will give you some advice. Go home. Mourn your son. and burn whatever papers you think you found. Is that a threat? I asked. It is a kindness, he hissed. There are things in this world that are bigger than you understand. And some things should stay with the dead. He stared at me, waiting for me to crumble. He expected me to cry or apologize. Instead, I gripped my bag tighter and met his gaze. I will see myself out, I said. I walked to the door, my legs feeling like lead. I could feel his eyes boring into my back until the heavy door clicked shut behind me. I got into my car and locked the doors immediately. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely put the key in the ignition. I drove through the gates and did not breathe easily until I was miles away on the highway. But as the fear began to recede, a cold resolve settled in my chest. Weston Hale had lied, he had panicked, and he had threatened me. He would not have done that if I was wrong. He did it because I was right. I looked at the road ahead. The image of his fearful eyes burned into my mind. You are afraid of me, Weston, I whispered to the empty car. You should be. Finding Linda Caro took me 3 days of digging through old yearbooks and cross-referencing marriage licenses at the county clerk office. I finally found her living in a small, weathered bungalow on the edge of the industrial district, miles away from the manicured lawns of Stonepine Ridge. She was a nurse now, working the night shift at the county hospital. I knocked on her door at 4 in the afternoon. She answered in her scrubs, looking exhausted. Her hair pulled back in a messy bun. When I told her I was Julian Harrow's mother, the colour drained from her face so fast I thought she might faint. Julian, she whispered, her hand trembling as it gripped the doorframe. I saw the news. I wanted to come to the funeral, but I was afraid of what I asked. Of him, she said, her voice barely audible. Please, come inside. Do not stand out here. Her living room was cluttered but clean. We sat at a small kitchen table. Linda made tea, but neither of us drank it. She stared at her hands, twisting a silver ring on her finger. Margot was my best friend, Linda began, her voice thick with unshed tears. We were roommates. When she got the job at Hale Enterprises, we celebrated. It seemed like such a huge opportunity. She was the lead accountant for his charitable foundation. What happened? Linda, I asked gently. Linda looked up, her eyes wide with fear. She found the numbers. Mrs. Harrow. It took her a year, but she found them. The foundation was a lie. Weston was raising millions of dollars for orphanages and disaster relief, but the money never went there. It went into shell companies. It went into his pockets. I felt a chill run down my spine. Fraud. Worse. Linda said. It was theft on a massive scale. Margot was terrified. She knew if she just quit, he would ruin her. She needed help. That is when she met Julian. Julian, I asked. How did they know each other? They met at a fundraiser. Linda explained. Julian was the only one who listened to her. He was the only one who believed her without asking for proof right away. They started meeting in secret. For over a year, they built a case. Julian wanted to take it to the FBI. He told her he would protect her. She let out a sob, covering her mouth. But Weston found out. I do not know how, but he found out. Margot disappeared, I said. She did not just disappear, Linda said, shaking her head violently. One night. She called me. She was crying. She said Weston had given Julian an ultimatum. She said, oh God. What did she say? I leaned forward, my heart hammering against my ribs. Linda took a deep, shaky breath. She said, "If Julian does not pay the money back, if he goes to the police, Weston will not just hurt us. He said he would go after Julian's mother." The room stopped spinning. Everything stopped. "Me," I whispered. "Yes," Linda said, tears streaming down her face. "Margot told me. He threatened to kill Mrs. Harrow. He told Julian he knew where she lived, where she shopped, what time she went to sleep. Julian was not paying for Margot, Mrs. Harrow. He was paying for you." I sat back in my chair, the wooden slats digging into my spine. The image of Julian walking into the bank every Monday morning flashed before my eyes. I had thought he was distant. I had thought he was too busy for me. I was wrong. Every Monday morning for 8 years. My son walked into that bank and paid a ransom for my life. He emptied his savings, sold his assets, and destroyed his own future to keep a monster away from my door. He let me believe he was just a busy, successful son, while he carried the weight of a death threat alone. "He saved me," I said, my voice sounding strange and detached. "He died, saving me. He loved you so much." Linda cried. "He told Margot that he would burn down the world before he let Weston touch you." I looked at the window. The rain had started to fall, drumming a steady rhythm against the glass. The grief that had been drowning me for weeks began to recede. In its place, something harder and much hotter began to form. It was a rage so pure it felt like clarity. Julian had sacrificed everything. He had lived in fear so that I could live in peace, and Weston Hale had killed him for it. I stood up. I felt steady. I felt strong. "Thank you." "Linda," I said, "you have given me the last piece of the puzzle." "What are you going to do?" she asked, looking at me with worry. I walked to the door and looked back at her. I did not look like a grieving mother anymore. "I am going to finish what my son started," I said. "Julian paid with money. Weston is going to pay with everything else." I turned Julian's study into a war room for 3 days and nights. I did not sleep in my bed. I slept in his leather chair, surrounded by the physical debris of his life and the digital trail of his torment. I was an archivist by trade. Organizing chaos was what I did best. Weston Hale thought he had buried the truth, but he had forgotten that paper leaves a shadow. I went through Julian's laptop. I guessed his password on the second try. It was his father's birthday. Inside a folder labeled simply taxes, I found subfolders deeply buried within the system files. Julian had been terrified. Yes, but he had also been meticulous. He had scanned every single handwritten threat Weston had slipped him. He had recorded dates, times, and locations of every drop-off. I took a large sheet of butcher paper and taped it to the wall. I drew a timeline in thick black marker. October 12th. 6 years ago, Margot Ellery goes missing. October 14th. 6 years ago, Julian makes the first withdrawal of $5,000. November 1st. 6 years ago. A shell company linked to Weston receives an anonymous donation of exactly $5,000. I traced the lines. It was a perfect circle. Julian withdrew cash. He gave it to Weston. Weston cleaned it through his fake charities. It was not just blackmail. It was money laundering. You were so sloppy. Weston? I whispered to the wall. You got greedy. I compiled 2 identical packages. The first contained copies of the bank records, the missing person report, and Julian's letters. I put it in a thick manila envelope and addressed it to Sarah Jenkins, the most tenacious investigative journalist at the State Chronicle. She had been trying to expose corruption in the City Development Board for years. This would be the story of her career. The second package was for the State Financial Oversight Committee. It was drier, filled with spreadsheets and tax ID numbers, but it was the nail in the coffin. I drove 2 towns over to mail them. I wore gloves. I paid in cash. When the metal slot of the mailbox clanged shut, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The fuse was lit. Now, I just had to make sure Weston knew who was holding the match. I did not hide. I did the opposite. I knew from my research that Weston took his lunch every Wednesday at the Gilded Oak, a private club downtown. I was not a member. But as the widow of a prominent local businessman, I was allowed in for grief counselling purposes, or so I told the front desk. I sat at a table near the window, ordering a pot of tea. At 12:30, Weston walked in. He was with 2 other men in expensive suits, laughing at some joke. He looked like a king holding court. Then he saw me. He stopped mid-step. The laughter died in his throat. I did not glare at him. I simply raised my teacup in a polite, silent toast. He turned pale. He whispered something to his associates and practically ran to a table in the back corner, keeping his back to me. I stayed for an hour. I watched him sweat. I watched him check his phone every 30 seconds. I watched him snap at the waiter. When his associates tried to engage him, he looked distracted, his eyes darting toward the door as if he expected the police to burst in at any moment. Rumours travel fast in circles like that. By Friday, the atmosphere in town had shifted. I went to the grocery store and overheard 2 women talking in the checkout line. "Did you hear about Weston Hale?" one whispered. "They say the auditors are at his office. My husband says people are pulling their money out of his fund. I heard he cancelled the gala." The other replied, "Something about health issues." I smiled as I placed my milk on the conveyor belt. It was working. The pressure was building. Weston was a man who thrived on control, on being the puppet master. Now, the strings were being cut, one by one. He was isolated. His friends were becoming scarce. His investors were getting nervous. I returned home and sat in the living room, waiting. The phone sat on the table in front of me. I knew he would call. Or he would come. A rat trapped in a corner eventually lunges. I checked the recording device I had taped under the coffee table. The red light was blinking steady and sure. I checked the one in my pocket. "Come on." "Weston," I said to the empty room, "come and tell me I'm wrong. Come and try to scare me again." I was not afraid of him anymore. I was the storm gathering on his horizon, and for the first time in 8 years, he was the one looking for shelter. The summons came at 8 in the evening. It was not an invitation this time. It was a demand delivered by a private courier who refused to look me in the eye. A black town car was waiting outside my house to take me to the Hale Enterprises Tower in the city. I checked the small digital recorder taped to the inside of my jacket pocket. I checked the backup recorder in my purse. Then I locked my front door and stepped into the car. The office building was a glass monolith piercing the night sky. But inside, it felt like a tomb. The lights were dimmed. The receptionist desk was empty. I was escorted up to the 42nd floor, where Weston Hale was waiting. He looked nothing like the composed titan of industry I had met at the estate. His tie was loosened, his collar unbuttoned, and his eyes were rimmed with red exhaustion. There were files scattered across his massive mahogany desk, and a half-empty glass of amber liquid sat dangerously close to the edge. He did not offer me a seat. You sent it, he said. His voice was low, a growl that vibrated in the quiet room. I do not know what you are talking about, I said, standing near the door. I kept my hands folded in front of me, projecting the image of a confused, harmless widow. Weston laughed, a harsh, barking sound. He picked up a folder and threw it across the room. Papers fanned out like white feathers before settling on the floor. Do not play stupid with me. Evelyn, he shouted. The Chronicle called me for a comment an hour ago. They have copies of the bank transfers. They have the dates. They have the shell company names. Only 2 people had access to that information. Me and Julian. He walked around the desk, advancing on me. Julian is dead. That leaves you. I did not flinch. I looked him dead in the eye and said, maybe the truth just has a way of surfacing. Mr. Hale. Julian spent 8 years trying to bury it with his own money. He paid you millions of dollars. He decimated his savings. He sold his property. And for what? To protect someone, Weston stopped. His face twitched. He was paying for his silence. Was he? I asked softly. Or was he paying because you threatened to kill his mother? The air in the room seemed to freeze. Weston looked at me, and for the first time, I saw genuine fear behind the anger. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing away from me. You do not understand how this works, he muttered, more to himself than to me. You think this is just about money? This is about legacy? This is about power. He turned back to me, his expression shifting into something desperate. How much, he asked. Excuse me. Name your price. Evelyn, he said, his words tumbling out fast. I can set you up for life. $5 million. $10 million. I can wire it to an offshore account tonight. You will never have to worry about a bill again. You can move to Europe. You can buy a villa in Tuscany. Just make a call. Tell the reporter the documents are fake. Tell them you forged them in grief. I looked at him with pity. He really thought money was the only currency that mattered. I do not want your money. Weston, I said, my voice steady and cold. I live in a small house that is paid for. I drive a 10-year-old car. I do not need a villa. I need to know why my son had to die, terrified. Weston slammed his hand on the desk. The sound echoed like a gunshot. You are a fool, he screamed. You act like a saint, but you are just an old woman who is out of her depth. Do you know who I am? Do you know what I can do? You are poking a sleeping dragon. Evelyn, you do not understand who you are fighting with. No. I stepped forward, closing the distance between us. You are the one who is mistaken. You think you are fighting a business rival. You think you are fighting a whistleblower. But you are not. You are fighting a mother who has buried her only child. I have nothing left to lose. Weston. And that makes me more dangerous than you will ever be. Weston was breathing hard, his chest heaving, his face was purple with rage. He looked at me with pure hatred. He was weak. Weston spat the words out. Julian was weak. He could have just looked the other way. He could have joined me. But no. He had to have a conscience. He had to be the hero. So you killed him, I said. It was not a question. I didn't. He started, then stopped. He took a ragged breath. I didn't touch Julian. I never wanted him dead. I just needed to keep him silent. The car, it wasn't supposed to happen like that. It was just a warning. I just needed him to stop digging. Silence crashed back into the room. Weston's eyes went wide. He realized what he had just said. He realized he had just confessed to orchestrating the intimidation that led to my son's death. I felt the small device in my pocket humming against my chest. It was done. A warning, I repeated, my voice devoid of emotion. You tampered with his car to warn him. Get out, Weston whispered, sinking back into his chair. He looked small now, defeated. Get out of my office. Gladly, I said. I turned and walked out of the room. I did not run. I walked with the steady, rhythmic pace of a woman who had just won the war. I took the elevator down to the lobby, walked past the security desk, and stepped out into the cool night air. I reached into my pocket and turned off the recorder. I held it in my hand for a moment, feeling its weight. It was light, plastic, and insignificant looking, but it contained the end of Weston Hale. You just needed him silent. I whispered to the night. Well, Mr. Hale. Now the whole world is going to hear him speak. I did not wait. The moment I left Weston's office, I drove straight to a secure drop box I had located for the State Attorney General's office. I deposited the small, insignificant-looking digital recorder, the only proof I had of Weston's verbal admission. I attached a notarized letter explaining the contents and naming the journalist, Sarah Jenkins, as the person who held the rest of the paper trail. 3 days later, the world burned. The headline on the State Chronicle was black and bold, "The Lies of Weston Hale." 8 years of corruption, blackmail, and a missing woman. Sarah Jenkins's article was a masterpiece of investigative reporting, weaving together the anonymous documents I had sent her with the financial data from the State Financial Oversight Committee. The story was everywhere. Weston's image, the philanthropist, the good corporate citizen, shattered into 1,000 pieces. The arrest came at noon. I watched the live footage on the local news channel. Police cars swarmed Stone Pine Ridge. Weston Hale, wearing an expensive silk robe, was led out in handcuffs. He looked arrogant, defiant, even as they pushed him into the back of a black SUV. But the real breakthrough came 2 hours later. The police, armed with a comprehensive warrant and Julian's precise documentation, began their search of the mansion. The detective in charge, a man named Sergeant Martinez, called me just after 2 in the afternoon. Mrs. Harrow. His voice was rough with suppressed emotion. We found it. In the sub-level basement. It was a panic room, hidden behind a wine cellar. Margot's files. I whispered. More than that. We found a small, locked chest. Inside were documents that confirmed every single one of your son's theories, the fake charity ledgers, the offshore accounts, and... He paused, and I heard him take a deep, shaky breath, and a small, leather-bound journal. It belonged to Margot Ellery. I gripped the phone so hard my knuckles turned white. Did she write about Julian? She did. He confirmed. On the last page, the ink is smeared, like she was crying or in a hurry. She wrote about her final meeting with Julian. Her final words are here. They are about you. I closed my eyes, bracing myself for the pain. Tell me. Sergeant Martinez read the words slowly, respectfully, and the sound of them broke me utterly. She wrote, I do not know what will happen to me now. Weston knows everything. But Julian has a plan. He said he would find a way to protect his mother. He told me he could never let him touch her. A guttural sob escaped me. It was not the cold fury that had driven me. It was raw, devastating grief. Julian had never stopped fighting. He had used his life, his wealth, his terrifying solitude to keep me safe. He had chosen to be the silent victim for 8 years so that I could live unaware. He had sacrificed everything. He was protecting me. I choked out to the detective. He did it all for me. Weston Hale was booked for fraud, money laundering, extortion, and obstruction of justice. His lawyers immediately tried to blame Julian, claiming the money was a loan or that Julian was Margot's accomplice. I would not allow it. The next day, I dressed in the black suit I had worn to Julian's funeral and walked into the state attorney's press conference. They tried to keep me back, but Sarah Jenkins recognized me and pulled me up to the podium. The cameras, the lights, the roar of the crowd, it was terrifying, but my fear was gone. I stood before the world and held up the faded receipts, Julian's shaky letters, and the transcript of Weston's confession. My son, Julian Harrow, was not a criminal. I stated, my voice ringing with a conviction I did not know I possessed. He was a hero. For 8 years, he was held hostage by a monster named Weston Hale, and he paid $2 million to ensure my safety. I told them about Margot Ellery, the brave accountant who stood up against corruption. I told them about her final words in her journal. Julian did not drive off the road by accident. I finished, looking straight into the lens of the nearest camera. He died because he finally tried to stop the man who was bleeding him dry. And now, the truth. The truth he paid for with his life is finally free. The press erupted. The story that had started as a financial scandal turned into a national tragedy. Julian was vindicated. Margot was honored as a whistleblower. Society was shocked by the sheer depravity of a man who preyed on a mother's love for her son. The first part of my revenge was complete. Julian was silent no more. The aftermath was a strange, subdued period of justice and public reckoning. Clearwater Bend, a town that prided itself on its quiet decorum, was forced to confront the dark secret festering at its heart. The town organized a silent candlelight vigil at the Glenstone Trust building, where Julian had made his weekly payments. People lined the street, holding signs with Julian's photo and Margot's name. Julian was no longer viewed as the aloof, busy businessman. He was the local boy who paid the ultimate price to protect his mother and expose corruption. It was a beautiful, heartbreaking testament to the son I had barely known. My mailbox was overflowing. I received hundreds of letters, not sympathy cards, but confessions and thanks. They came from people Weston Hale had swindled, intimidated, or driven out of business. He took our family farm 10 years ago. We thought we were just bad business people. Now we know. Thank you, Mrs. Harrow. Your son's courage means my husband and I can finally testify against that monster. Reading those letters, I realized my revenge was not just about Weston's imprisonment. It was about the quiet restoration of dozens of broken lives. I took the small insurance payout from Julian's estate, the only thing he had not drained, and established the Julian Harrow and Margot Ellery Financial Safety Foundation. Its purpose was simple: to provide legal aid and financial support for women and families being manipulated or extorted by powerful men in corporate settings. It was a tangible monument to their shared sacrifice, just as the momentum seemed to slow. A package arrived at my home. It was marked confidential and contained no return address. Inside, I found a jump drive and a thick stack of printouts. The accompanying note was short. Weston Hale has many victims. Julian was not the only one. Check the files. The sender turned out to be a former personal assistant of Weston's, who had been fired unjustly before the scandal broke. The documents on the jump drive were damning. They revealed that the blackmail scheme was much wider than I had initially thought. Julian was only one of several business rivals Weston had extorted. More critically, the files detailed a substantial, hidden offshore trust. A staggering amount of money, over $50 million, had been moved out of the country in the days immediately following Julian's death. The transfer was made to an anonymous numbered account in the Cayman Islands, but the final routing address was cryptic, a small, legitimate-looking real estate shell company registered in Miami. "He prepared for this," I murmured, running my hand over the printout. He knew the walls were closing in, and he secured his future. This revelation brought a renewed, chilling clarity. Weston in jail was one thing. Weston in jail with $50 million waiting for him was another entirely. The story was not over. The payment was incomplete. That night, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I slept without the crushing weight of unknowing. Julian was vindicated. He was resting. That silent assurance gave me strength. But I knew Weston Hale. His lawyers were already working to cut a deal, trading information for a reduced sentence. He would try to sell his confession. I needed to be ready for the final, gruesome detail he would exchange for a lighter sentence. I sat up, turning on my desk lamp. I began to research the Miami Shell Company. I was no longer grieving. I was preparing for the final, unexpected act of a drama I had been forced to star in. The first layer of revenge justice had been served. The second layer, the truth about Julian's death, was still waiting to be excavated in the courtroom. And I needed to be there when that final bomb dropped. I had a feeling that the hardest confession was yet to come. The detective called me at 3 p.m. "Mrs. Harrow, Weston Hale wants to talk. He is trying to negotiate a plea. He has offered up information regarding your son's accident." I drove to the state police barracks with a terrible sense of anticipation. I knew the confession about the extortion was the opening move. This, the truth about Julian's death, was the price of his soul. I sat with Sergeant Martinez in a small, windowless office. Julian's file lay open on the table. Weston was brought in, looking significantly smaller than he had in his skyscraper office. He was flanked by his defense attorney, who looked nervous. Weston avoided my eyes, but his confession was clear and chilling. The accident was not random. The detective began, summarizing Weston's plea. "Mr. Hale admits he hired a technician to tamper with Julian's car, not to kill him, but to cause a temporary loss of control, a near miss to frighten him into submission and ensure he continued the payments." I felt the blood drain from my face. It was worse than I had imagined. It was calculated terror. Weston leaned forward, his voice hoarse, desperate to sound remorseful. I didn't want him dead. I promise you. Evelyn. I just needed him to stop going to the authorities. He told me he was out of money, and I just needed to show him the consequences. I didn't think he would crash. I didn't intend to kill him. But he needed to understand the seriousness of the situation. The raw, panicked sound of his voice hit me, but the pain, the agony of the previous weeks, turned ice cold. I did not cry. I did not shout. I felt a profound, absolute silence descend over me, sharp and dangerous as a knife blade. Sergeant Martinez nodded. "Our technical team has already found evidence of chemical tampering on the steering components consistent with Mr. Hale's statement." The warning shot became fatal. Julian was not just blackmailed. He was murdered. I looked at the detective. "Can I speak to him?" "Alone." Martinez hesitated, then looked at Weston's attorney, who shrugged. The attorney knew that Weston had nothing left to lose. The confession was already out. Weston and I were left alone in the stark interrogation room. The heavy metal table separated us. Weston looked up at me, his eyes pleading. "Evelyn? Please, tell the prosecutor I was coerced. Tell them I cooperated. I can make this right. I can still pay you." I did not move toward him. I did not raise my voice. I spoke one single, final sentence that held 8 years of my son's terror and my own quiet rage. "You will live long enough to see everything you did to Julian, to Margot, and to everyone you stole from exposed in agonizing detail." Weston's shoulders slumped. He put his head down, resting his forehead on his clasped hands. The arrogance, the wealth, the power, it all melted away. He was just a defeated, middle-aged man facing ruin. I had won the war, not by killing him, but by making sure he lived to watch his empire burn. The trial was swift, the evidence was overwhelming, and Weston's plea, along with the chilling confession of tampering, guaranteed a severe outcome. He was convicted of multiple counts of fraud, extortion, and involuntary manslaughter for Julian's death. The media followed every twist, and Weston Hale became a national symbol of corporate evil. Julian was finally and completely vindicated, his name cleared of any association with criminal activity. I walked out of the courthouse on the day of the sentencing, the sun warm on my face. I was alone, but I did not feel empty. In my hand, I held the final, unsent letter Julian had written to Margot. It was dated the day before he died. I smoothed the paper. Justice was never about bringing Julian back. It was about making sure that the man who had terrified him and then killed him could never hurt anyone again. It was about making sure my son's 8 years of silent sacrifice were not in vain. And now, the truth, at long last, was free. Thank you all so much for listening to Julian and Margot's story. If you've made it this far, please let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from. Don't forget to subscribe to Grandma's Family Diary, give this video a big thumbs up, and hit that hype button. It really helps us get this story heard by more people who need to know the truth.